After once more debating the risks, John decided that he would be as quiet as possible as to reduce any risk of cave-in. He just had to look. Taking a deep breath, he managed to squeeze through the opening with a little effort. Into the darkness inside, using a small light on the back of his phone, he was now better situated to survey his surroundings in a greater detail. The air was significantly colder, stinging the back of his throat as he inhaled, and although he had expected the interior to be cooler than the outside due to the volume of stone used in the building's construction, the church in reality felt more like a cryptid than any other place of worship. Stepping as carefully as he could, trying not to disturb or dislodge the large piles of rubble on the floor, John kept his eyes trained on the roof overhead, nervous that any loud noise might bring a piece of masonry down on top of him. The extent of the damage now became clear, with the occasional small shard of light penetrating the darkness down below from a few open wound-like holes above. However, the hall remained surprisingly dim. John felt this as curious as he felt the interior around him should have been more visible somehow. It's as if the light was being absorbed by the darkened corners of the hall, but he immediately dismissed it as his notion as financial and cited his own escalating imagination as a good reason to anyway to keep his nerves in check. Isolated by unnoticed environments, could even the most rational of minds. After climbing over the substantial piles of rubble, being careful to avoid several large pieces of broken wood jutting out of the underneath, he finally found himself at the rear of the church hall. There lay an altar, a table carved from stone and soothed by insensitive and devoted hands. It was easy to imagine how frightening the priest from the Dark Ages would have seemed, poised up there from spouting up fearsome tales. From an enlightened position, foaming at the mouth about damnation and demonic forces preying on the souls of the weak. A sense of elation and excitement filled John's mind to be standing near something such as deep as a sense of history, yet he considered wary the possibility that the altar had been quarried from that very hill, wrenched from a deposit of rock deep in the ground, born of process far older than any humanity himself. But the thrill of such an old and rare discovery quickly extinguished those thoughts. So enamored by the subject he was almost overlooked by a small opening doorway to the right of the altar, which appeared to lead down to a flight of stairs into the underground chamber, possibility a vault or tomb. Shivering at the thought of what lay bound down below, he knew that even his level of skepticism, there would be no venturing down there, superstition or not. Wandering underneath a floor clearly decaying building was not a wise idea. Pointing his phone narrow of a beam of a white light to the rear of the hall, it cast a diminutive yet unwelcome glare over a series of dusty steps which led up to the altar's platform. A natural arrangement from what a priest or a preacher would have delivered their service hundreds of years ago. But there it felt like as a little natural about it or its housing. Again, a creeping unease began to rummage his mind as imagine of a fervent and enraged holy man standing above all, shouting cryptic and doom-laden parables of the ancient origin at a huddled, confused, and frightened congregation. Making his way onto the platform, eager to study the inspection of the wall more closely, his attention was unfortunately distracted from the cluttered ground as his foot clipped a broken rock lying on the last step. Stumbling forward abruptly, John's shoulders slammed painfully against the edge of the stone altar before reaching out a hand to break the fall on his cold, hard platform floor. The noise of his fall echoed throughout the building, with the sound originating from the wall to roof. For a second he imagined what he heard was a fainter sound from stirring somewhere, but far answering from any kind, a small piece of debris plummeted from above, smashing the ground, teasing and threatening a series of heavier and deadlier replies yet to come. Relief coursed through his body, glad he was able to be the object and not been more sustainable in size. and even more to that in stone, impacted in the front of the doorway rather than against his head. He was becoming increasingly unsure as to his safety. Regaining a solid footing, he stood up on the platform, holding his shoulder, which now had battered and bruised, keeping his eyes trained onto the roof nervously, but all in the gentle wind whistling through the holes and gasps at the building's outer shell. Silence was abundant, anxious that any movements might bring the entire ceiling down on top of him. John waited several minutes before assuming the temporary safety from further falling mastery. Then slowly and carefully than before, he turned it at praise from the altar more closely. Religious iconography he dotted around the lines with strange jagged symbols which he did not quite recognize. It was easy to imagine the common of sorts being given from there, each member of the congregation somberly approaching, disheveled and malnourished, receiving the blessing from the stern priest who spoke of one of the rafts of love. John would happily concede anyone who that is not the most creative or imaginary of nature. But there is an unforgotten place that he was surprised by how vivid the impressions were. He could almost see those who would not have worshipped here, pallid faces, sheltering from the bitter cold of winter, bodies withered in the fruitless produce of a poor harvest, yet fear of something extraordinary and undefinable suffocating their every thought. Yes, the church was such a decrypt of the little place that was easy for the mind to populate it with the ghosts of lamented souls. Of course, he had no way of knowing how correct or inaccurate his assumptions were. Shrinking off the shivers of the wandering in his mind, and laughing to himself for being so easily affected by the place, John's gaze finally fell upon the inscription carved above, into the black wall. Reaching out, ran his fingers through the dips and rough edges left by the offerer's chisel. It was clear that the message on the walls were out of place, rushed as if it was each letter unaligned with those that came before it, suggesting them to be a project of someone hurried, wishing to spend as little time within the church as possible. Standing back, the light from his phone now illuminated with the words that which came sharply into focus. Those that dwelt in Dungworth took this hill in 1472. In 1481, we gave it back in hopes that we would disturbed it would forgive us as our trespasses. Contemplating the meaning of the inscription, he stood there motionless once more, and fearfully apologetic wording began to gently disturb him. Even though his region was one of struggle, or had been having previously settled by another clan, or perhaps the original inhabitants of the hill shared a preoccupation with a myth and superstition with their modern counterparts in the village below. At first, the noise didn't filter in entirely with his awareness. It was only then he repeated the uneven rhythm that his mind recognized by its nature. Still facing the inscription, his back turned towards the church hall, the creeping cold sensation he had experienced outside returned sharply to his arms. His body quivered in retaliation to his temperature, which had nose-dived into the alarming rate. His breath was visible, and panicked puffs in front of his face. John's flesh crawled back once more with fear as the sound of one's foot scuffing the stone floor nearby was slowly followed by another. But who would be such in a place? Not one of the villagers, not even their superstitions and stories of warnings and omen about the hillside. The footsteps felt close, and his confidence diminished. John's thought now fled simply to escape. As the noise increased in volume, threatening persistently, it was clear that he would have to rush past whoever stood there to make it for the door. There was nothing left for it. He had to push the jarring fear which now gripped on him out of his mind. Slowly he turned to his face whoever was behind him. For a moment he thought that he would be faced with the strained faces of those from his imagination. But all the hall was devoid of life, empty, yet still the sound of feet scuffing cold stone, like paper on skin, filled the air. John's frozen grasp rang out as something moved in the corner of his eye. Turning quickly into the darkened doorway, which led underneath, the head of an indescribable figure moved, its body raised up slowly with each shuffling from the step below. Terror coursed through his veins in such a degree that his rationality melted away, only to be replaced by pure instinct. As he burst into a sprint, jumping off the platform, leaving the altar and a description behind, he felt a deep and unyielding fear tear at his insides. Stumbling as he landed, the most impact dislodged of more debris. From above, several pieces of large stone smashed into the church floor, one narrowly missing a head only by a few inches. The exit drew even closer, and fevered thoughts now filled his mind as he scrambled over for the piles of ruined and forgotten shieldment. Dead skin cast off the ancient building without remorse. For a moment he felt surrounded, impressed by upon the man of the cloth preaching a sin, an ancient evil, while a pitiable and diminished congregation huddled together in fear of what walked nearby. As the footsteps scuffed to the dirt and dust-ridden floor, John's clarity of mind returned as he began to climb up into a large pile of broken wood and stone, the door safety on the other side. His curiosity calmed his nerves momentarily. He drained and he felt his stomach hold on to him onward, but to cut open, away from that place. But he needs to know it was relentless. He had to look. Taking a deep breath, he turned cautiously towards the altar, slowly casting a light from his phone towards the darkened staircase. The air in the hall now grew closer, John's panicked breath visible in the dim light. Darkness seemed to have clouded his vision, yet he could picture what was unmistakable. A tall figure now stood in the doorway, but deep impression of the tortured and perverted humanity emanated from it. Both men and the Thing exchanged a long and silent stare. Then a croaking stirring of stabilities emerged from the figure's mouth, a language that had long forgotten, and while still persist definition, included John's understanding. The contemplant within the spoke did not. The shape of the doorway was now moved towards it as it imitated its sullen movements. John cried out in terror, haphazardly clinging onto the rubble, attempting to reach its summit, and then make his way to the door. Now he did not care for the silence, his clambering movements echoing throughout the halls, several pieces of stone plunging once more from the roof. As he reached the top of the mound, at the very last moment he peered above, only to see a rock as large as a man hurtling towards him. Jumping for his life, he tumbled down to the other side of the debris pile. As his body rolled down onwards towards the floor in a shearing pain wrenched through his side, slamming against the stone ground, the impact surged into his bones, leaving him dazed momentarily. Staggering to his feet, he looked down, only to recoil in horror. A large chunk of wood had impaled itself several inches from its right side. Blood poured from the wound as he almost instinctively pulled at the piece of wood, it granting against his insides before finally removed. He finally let out an anguished scream, but he did as he did so turn to a noise from behind. The pain on his side was agony, but the sight of it he beheld was worse than any sensation. The figure was on the door, quivering on its belly, dragging itself at the impossible speed over the rubble and towards him. Its body blackened, and its bandaged remains of the white shroud, sliding over the jagged surface with ease. Stumbling in shock, John was paralyzed with fear. Then the realization took him. Escape was close, limping badly towards the door. Its light was opening now within its grasp. He shoved his body through the gap into the light outside. The door pressed proudly in his wound on his side, skidding the strikes of pain piercing through the abdomen. With one last push, he screamed, the force of the momentum causing him to fall through the ground outside. Looking up through the gap and stared at the embalmed figure with its face sneering from the inside, its arms outstretched, spitting vile and deafening groan to the retreated sunshine. John did not take this time to observe the creature. He staggered once more to his feet, and then his hand that was now drenched in blood. He clutched it from his wound on his side, moving quickly as he got away from that place, leaving the church grounds behind him. He was sure that he heard voices from deep inside as he fled. The yells, vitriolic protests of long sensibility and congestion, mocking and resentful and despised. In his haste, he had lost track of the direction, unfamiliar with his surroundings. In the grip of panic, he limped as fast as he could, but the disoriented took him before he was aware of how or why he found himself surrounded by a maze of broken and toppled gravestones. Dizzied and gasped for air, he could no longer care where he was, just as long as he would have to leave the church and his attendant behind. After catching some breath, he began to negotiate the old cemetery, some headstones large and looming over it while the others humbled and ruined. Then, as its suffering effects of the unknown poison, the world began to spin as he tried to catch his breath once more. The stones took a look at obnoxious and menacing form, towering above, blocking out the light, staring forcefully down at him. It was not a graveyard to which he had now stood in, but a ring of warped stones several feet high. They had been rivered by many storms, and ancient and forgotten, long before the first brick had laid in the adulterated church. Feeling compelled to somehow be coming closer to them, he had reached out his hand, touching the moss-covered surface. Flashes of hidden past now filled his mind, as he felt overcome with his faintness. His vision clouded, the world around began to spin as abrupt nausea swamped his senses, one which was so intense that it knocked him to his knees, and although he struggled valiantly against his grip, within seconds he crumpled onto the ground, and wound on his side heaving and throbbing with the beat of his heart. Lying on his back, staring above, the sky seemed to pulse, and everything around became distorted as he was detached from the world, viewing it through a thick and warped lens of glass. The light curved inward unnaturally, and the veil of the world was now drooped black as John gazed into the abyss behind him. Awareness had left him. He awoke to the silence of the earth. Wisp of broken grass touched his cheek, and the wind carried him away to an unknown destination. The sky was black, while truly no living thing stirred. John did not even know how long he had been gone unconscious, but the blankets of the stars above him left no doubt that it had been several hours. The sickness remained, although not as potent, but his wounds still aside wept blood. Rising to his feet, it became clear that his body was still under the effects of whatever was on that hill, the intoxication from it. The world that had possessed a fluid, watery form, but even closing its eyes for a moment, he felt that he had somehow become accustomed to it, at least to the point where he could gain his bearings to go find the route to escape. Luck was on his side as the moon was present above, albeit only as particle waning crescent. This provided him enough illumination to gauge the strange world and its shapes which surrounded him. He was unsure if he remained where he had fallen in the ancient standing stones, which he remembered vividly and with no sense of dread, nowhere to be seen. But as he stood there with his hands vainly attempting them the blood from his sides, a frightening realization crept towards him. John had found it difficult to confide with me, but in the simple words that it was, but he described it as the rules of nature unturned. Nothing seemed to make sense, even when for a moment he did not even know who he was. When he was there, what was the abominable source was causing such illness with him? He seemed to have retained the knowledge of the hill and memory of the church, but his thoughts were turbulent and disconnected. Fleeting moments that would identify quickly had been surprised and replaced by utter confusion. But regardless the affliction, one of the constant remained. His instincts pleaded him to leave that place immediately, but his fragile state of mind, he could not tell which way he would lead him down to the land below, to which route would send him upward. Whoever or whatever sat on the cement, the sensory intoxication would experience unlike other. The world unravel. A smell of sickness tinged the air, Whatever it was, his own vomit or the illness playing tricks, he did not know. But what's the stench there was something else. A smell of dampness mixed with unsettling scent of burnt hair. It became strong that it began to sting John's eyes, which only furthered his disorientation. Though through his eyes were clouded by tears, and the world seemed wrong, he was now sensed that he can only describe as his presence as. The musty smell had increased potentially as it did. John let out a cough. The response to the noise was distant, and even though he believed that it was impossible to know if someone or something approached it with so malice and hatred as its companions. Terror now returned to the fleeting purpose as he quietly wandered past through the shadowed trees amongst the wild grass, hoping to find his way out. Staggering as he fumbled his way through the darkness, the pain in his side grew, and the thoughts of dying out there on the hill, never to be found by his loved ones, became apparent. For a moment he thought that he would collapse once more. But, while the sickness intensified, it was now accomplished by the sound of dead grass, wilted flora being thrust aside as something trudged through the undergrowth nearby. John's vision was now so poor that he could not tell which way was forward and within back, and in fleeting moments of clarity he felt repulsed by the idea of ending up back up at the church or stones or graves, unsure where they have been. He was utterly lost, and something which still called hideous hillside home now approached. But silence nor darkness could shield him. No realm of obliteration could provide obscurity, for a wickedness as old as the earth was now stalked a man who once laughed at the face of superstition and myth. The air grew denser of what the little light of the silver moon above provided and diminished as if though they were being sucked deep into the ground with no escape. Then nothing. The noise of the branches and the grass of being broken and pushed to a side ceased, and its place of void of sound, almost unbearable. At the end of its nerves, John could feel any remaining vestige of hope or escape abandon him. It was close. Its breath could be felt upon the air, foul, rancid, as if something which long ago lived and yet in a required desire to cause hurt and pain. Then movement. Dead leaves crack under its weight, and as long as grass, which it had seemed to be more impresentable, so dominant now and torn that the broken now with its each shuffling stride. The only thought in John's mind now was to hide. Slowly his breath shuddered, and quietly gasping, he sank into the long grass, and there he lay silent, terrified. The presence was still closer, and in the darkness, had thought at the time, he could see the vague shape of a figure wandering just out of reach. It circled slowly, coming closer to retreating, as if searching for the ground methodically. Then, finally, the sound of its cumbersome footsteps grew distant, and then ceased. John breathed a sigh of relief. Then a hand touched his face. Survival now took him with a yell of utter terror as he rolled onto his side. The shearing pain went through his body as his own weight and motion thrust an uneven pace ground deep to his wound. A low groan had escaped from whatever monstrosity stood before him. Then, without knowing which way to proceed, John became motivated by a new impetus. Jumped to his feet and bolting at random direction, hoping beyond that it would just lead it out of madness, that nightmare. The trees and grass flew in the pitch of a black night. A thick miasma of sickness and burnt hair encircled everything, escalating the convulsive reaching as he ran. At least he knew where he was. He had his bearing, and it was one that he hoped that we would never possess again. The church loomed tall and twisted before him. Something hurtled through the trees behind him, and in a moment it would be upon him. At least he knew which direction to go, running as he did so on the side, towards the path to which he ascended earlier that day, a worn track which he led him to safety. But the land appeared unfamiliar and unnatural. The very shape of construction of his environment seemed to have been to the unknown and malevolent mind. He had to continue on, to get away from what pursued him. The path must have been in that direction. Then finally he broke through a line of trees and bushes into a clearing. His heart sank as the depths as he did not know. There stood there the church once more, but appeared to be a different somehow. By night the building seemed possessed and more sinister and bizarrely altered from its daytime persona. For a moment John imagined the steeple might not be of a rock or stone or concrete, but the vine of earth of wood which spiraling towards heaven, to which it had been long spat out since the world. The rustle of the trodden leaves approached once more as he stumbled and gasped for air. The pain from his wound was now almost unbearable. Each step forward was accompanied by an internal blinding, tearing sensation. Forced to flee across the face to the church near by his stalker, John had moved as best he could, staggering and limping, weak and exhausted, entering a thick network of brambles and thorns. His clothes caught, and barbed appendages from the plants scratched his face and arms, and it was no use. He could not outrun what was coming. Looking over his shoulder, someone was clearly ripping through the branches only a few feet behind him. Fear coursed through John's veins as his stalker now bore down on him. Letting out a cry of pain and anguish, the thing amongst the branches seemed to be on top of the moment, observing his struggle. His hands cut and grazed by the thorns. John had pulled and grabbed by the thicket in front, trying to escape, and then to chill bones once. The figure behind stared, letting out a harrowing groan, somewhere between a laugh and the slight of satisfaction. It began moving at great speed, breaking through the entangled circle of cage of thorns and branches with ease, closing it in quickly. With a scream of pain and disbelief, John finally broke free of the thorns. Embrace but despair haunted him. There was a church that stood once more, almost mocking, twisting, and warped in ways that no human could achieve or conceive of. With staggering with a little fight left, he moved past the church once more as a silent broke through the tree line, rushing towards him. John increased his pace as best he could, but now he could muster a little speed. The heavens now opened, and the swaths of liquid poured over the church, flowing over to the ground beneath which he completely became sodden to the water-logged. John's strength diminished as he fell to his knees, admitting defeat as the hunted animal relents to the end, then salvation. From far away shone a light, one that beamed and broke through, almost incomprehensible. Surrounding the thickets, something to hold on to hope, an anchor to follow, a light from outside of that terrible hill. As the sound of his pursuer neared, scrambling across the grass and darkness, one last surge of energy awoke John from his terrible fate. The sight of the light and life that reunited with that small vestige of hope remained. He then screamed in agony as he lifted himself onto his feet. The rain now slashing down upon him drenched him to the bone, pouring onto his hole on the side, but it did not matter. All that mattered was that it was light, and the safety to which it had promised. Limping as quickly as he could in that direction, he thrust himself into the vines of the branches of the entangled woodland, fear overriding any pain brought to the thorns scratched and cut his skin. Yet he was making progress. The light began to loom larger and larger, vibrant and sustaining. It was now clear now that he was heading downhill towards the momentum of his trajectory, caused by the stumble and fall after fall. It also increased his speed markedly. Flashes and memories, and not his own once again, invaded his mind. Thoughts of anger and hatred filled his vision, images of that church never empty, yet absent of the living. As the priest reared at his hands, so bowed the congregation hands. Confusion was beginning to seep into him again, and the smell of burnt hair once more filled the world around. Although cumbersome, his stalker could be heard increasing pace, yet it seemed to be more agitated than before. Angered, perhaps even frustrated, John felt sick with panic, as the blood now pouring through his wound from his side. unlimited, just as the light as it seemed closest. The promise of redemption, safety, and escape loomed near. He then flew down steep incline of grass, slipping into the white and mud, and tumbled at the speed into the ground. Pain, exhaustion, and hopelessness ruled supreme at his body, already battered and bruised, came to rest on top of the large fallen trunk of the tree. The clambering of footsteps now drew near as they did so. So John fought to himself that he would need to that which he laid upon, which had been victims of cruel and hidden evil, which had called from the hillside home, "Come on, son! Get up! Get up!" A voice yelled in the darkness, almost drowned out by the now fervent breaking of the ground and grass behind. The world seemed warped but conscious as now prepared for whatever would be on his mind. Clarity returned, and John realized where he was. His body was slumped not against a fallen tree, but against a wooden gate which marked the boundary of that terrible place. Something was close. That thing which had now been hounding him was in the dark, was only a feet away. "Move! It's nearly upon you!" cried now a familiar voice of Dale. With that last movement, with the final piece of momentum left and life in him, Jarnar opened up the gate, falling face first into a puddle by the roadside. I sat transfixed, the words flowing around John in stuttering fashion, yet convention, to which in reality I found it difficult to ignore. Regardless of my skepticism, this man had believed every fiber of the being of what he had just told me was the truth. Dale had apparently went after him, against the wishes of the other villagers. He had long ago lost a son, and did not wish to lose anyone else to succumb to the apparent of the malevolence of the hillside. The landlord, beginning the old feeling of the farmers, eventually gave in, and both men traveled to the foot of the hill in hopes that John would find their light in the darkness to follow it, and be the first to escape from then living memory. No matter how much they had wished to help, though, they would not dare to touch that gate, nor cross that hill's threshold. John had to do that on his own, and he did just as his pursuer leaned over him. I remember letting out a sigh of relief as he finished the last time the wine in front of the fire. There was a moment of silence between us, and I realized that the entire bar was bathed in nauseous resistance, one in which was almost tangible, almost as if the president wanted to speak, but dare not. Finally I spoke, attempting to be as reassuring as possible. "That is an amazing story, John, but it's just a story. I'm sure there's a rational explanation for it all." He bowed his head gravely, staring at the floor. "If it's just a story, then why can't I leave?" he said, looking up at me with the expression of half caught in fear and half trapped in desperation. "What do you mean you can't leave?" "I've been here for 3 months," he shouted. "Sometimes I wish Dale had just left me there." "John," I said, leaning over and resting my hand on his shoulder reassuringly, "you can leave whenever you want." But I could only see from expression from there that he did not believe me. He had been consumed by whatever myths and superstitions by the locals had fed him. I concluded that his psyche had been poisoned. Of course, I felt that the landlord had meant others as well, but I was sure that was conventional explanation would hopefully cure him as effective mind. "I'm going to Glasgow tomorrow," I said cheerfully. "Why not join me? The bus will be here in the afternoon and we could travel back together, but, of course, I'm not forgetting you have your car with you. Don't think I was fishing for a lift." I laughed, but John stared at me grimly and answered, "My car is sitting out back, wrecked." "Really? I hope it's not too bad. What happened?" "It took me several days to recover from my experience on the hill," he said mournfully before continuing. "But when I felt up to it, I packed my bags, I thanked Dale and the landlord, and then drove out of the village. A couple of miles into my journey, then the rain came down in the sheets. Visibility was terrible, but I just wanted to leave. I lost control of the car and went straight into a tree. I would survive, but the car is a write-off." "Well, accidents do happen. As long as you're okay, how about another drink?" I said, standing up. As I did so, John grabbed me by my arm forcefully. "It was no accident. There was something else on that road. I saw him standing there. A man, I think. At least it appeared like a man. I swerved to avoid him. And good thing, too. The last thing you would want is to be accidentally kill a local. My jokes were once more not appease his frustrations. I sat back down as he was conveyed unto his predicament. After the incident with the car, or and which had towed back to the inn by Dale, John tried everything he could to leave. Each time he attempted to use a local bus, there would be a problem. It would break down, or there'd be a landslide, stopping it from entering the village. And he even claimed as to why it had been stranded overnight, because he had intended to take the bus again for the day. The man was adapted. For 3 months he had been a guest at the Laird of Dungworth, and yet no matter how hard he tried, he could not leave the outskirts of the village. Several times he had even tried to hike the nearest town, but only one occasion he was bitten back by the bitter and perilous weather that appeared without warning. He even tried to go to the phone for help, but his mobile phone seemed to have no signal, while using a landline as a result of a continuous static. The same applied for anyone who tried to make a call on his behalf. While I could not explain everything that happened, I was certain that the series of rational and conventional events could have accounted for each. It seemed to be madness that someone so obviously intelligent in horticulture to be made for such a belief in nonsense. I generally felt sympathy for the man. You are fell victim to a self-fulfilling prophecy, I said confidently. What do you mean? John replied. I have worked in many villages like this. You come to an old part of the country with a haunting landscape. Like this one is another world compared to your modern life in London. Then you are to provide with paranoia fuel, a myth that the locals believe that the cursed part of the land. Taking all that in, you have some terrible luck hitting a tree with your car, and before you know it, you believe in the whole thing. Perhaps you even imagine the figure on the road. Maybe the whole encounter. What about the hill? He asked, obviously intrigued by any possibility of escape that could be achieved. Probably a placebo effect from all your stories you've heard. That, or who knows? Maybe you had food poisoning or a virus of some kind and hallucinated the entire thing. Maybe there is even some nut up here about what's living in the church. It was obvious that it remained convinced, but I felt that it was my duty to take this poor soul out of the village, get back to Glasgow, where he should, hopefully make arrangements to when I get home. I had seen the damage that had unfounded beliefs that could cause amongst people and communities before, and I was generally impaled by it. I just wanted to help. Tomorrow, we'll get the bus together, and I'll buy you a pint in Glasgow. He never said much to me in return, other than nodding his head reluctantly in agreement.